Hello and welcome. I'm Leanne Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. The price of oil drops after Trump makes assurances, but his Secretary of War promises the most intense day of US strikes on Iran. Meanwhile, Russia's Vladimir Putin holds a phone call with the US president to discuss the ongoing conflict and a solution to the global energy crisis. But critics say Trump is not taking the war seriously as he jokes about sinking Iranian ships. Oil prices have dropped today after US President Donald Trump told reporters the war with Iran would end very soon. Oil rose to over $100 a barrel on Monday, but is now closer to $90 a barrel after the president said the US was very far ahead of schedule, but they hadn't won enough yet. Take a listen.
It's the beginning of building a new country, but they have no Navy, they have no Air Force. They have no anti-aircraft equipment. It's all been blown up. They have no radar. They have no telecommunications. And they have no leadership. It's all gone. So, you could look at that statement. We could call it a tremendous success right now as we leave here. I could call it, or we could go further. And we're going to go further. But the big risk on that war has been over for 3 days. We wiped them out in the first 2 days.
Meanwhile, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said today would be the most intense day of strikes. Take a listen.
We will not relent until the enemy is totally and decisively defeated. But we do so. We do so on our timeline and at our choosing. For example, today will be yet again our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. Intelligence more refined and better than ever. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, the last 24 hours have seen Iran fire the lowest number of missiles they've been capable of firing yet.
I'm now joined by Jonathan Watchell, Global Affairs Analyst and former US diplomat at the United Nations. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me this evening. We just heard from Pete Hegseth and also Donald Trump, but let's start with Hegseth, because he says today will be the most intense day of strikes on Iran so far, while claiming Iran's missile launches have dropped in the past 24 hours. Does this signal the conflict is actually nearing a turning point, or does this risk further escalation?
Well, certainly, Leanne, there's further escalation in terms of the bombardment that the Iranians are going to feel from the U.S. military, as Secretary of War Hegseth said. It also signals that certainly there is more of a free hand of the U.S. military to strike in ways that it wants to because of the diminished ability of Iran to lash out with those launching of missiles. That doesn't mean that, Iran is on its back completely. It certainly can cause great harm. And we see the disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz as a point in case of just much the Iranians still have the ability to enact pain, in this case, economic pain on a global scale.
And it's really interesting because in the past 24 hours, President Donald Trump has warned Iran over the Strait of Hormuz, while also saying he may be open to talks. Does this mix of pressure and diplomacy suggest a real path to any negotiations with Iran? And you also touched on the energy prices and what people are seeing around the world, that as this war does cause shockwaves everywhere to the economic pain.
Certainly, Leanne, the global world, all of our eyes watching this conflict and looking at the way the stock market has been affected and oil prices and around the globe, certainly looking at this and thinking, boy, it would be nice if this conflict wound down very quickly. And certainly we did see an immediate reaction in oil markets to even President Trump saying that this will not be a prolonged conflict. That said, the fighting is continuing. The Iranian regime is showing no sign of caving in and even agreeing to talks. It's been more defiant posture, and certainly the selection of Ali Khamenei's son, who's a hardliner, to carry on the policies of dad, is not something that gives a signal of any sort of regime change or change of direction per se. So there's still this intense standoff, and we can anticipate at least days of more fighting as a result of that.
And Haig said the day after strikes on Iran will serve U.S. interests, and that is what matters most to President Trump and also the American people. But meanwhile, the German leader says the U.S. and Israel have no common plan to quickly end the war with Iran. What do you make of this?
Israel and the United States, of course, have very different approaches to this. For Israel, Iran has been an existential threat for decades. It's been arming these Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Shia militias that have been preying on Israel for decades and caused great economic harm, emotional harm for Israel, and for that matter, actually, to the Gulf states. It's been an ongoing menace of concerns, including Saudi Arabia having to deal with the Houthis, who were armed by Iran, hitting the oil sector there. So this is nothing new. It's something that's been out there. But for the United States, obviously, it's more of an economic and, of course, geopolitical in terms of brinkmanship on the world stage type of thing. But for nations that are on the receiving end of these missiles and drones, it is terrifying, and it has huge impact. And there's a desire to not be under assault, as it were. Now, for the Israelis, it's about getting the job done. It's about actually taking out the regime so it's no longer this existential threat moving forward, going back to a time in which Iran and Israel, for instance, before the Islamic Revolution, enjoyed relations together and a hope to get away from what has been a failed situation that has created so much havoc, not just for Israel, but across what is called the Shia Crescent, as you know, menacing everyone from Lebanon to Syria, Iraq, Iran, Gaza, and Yemen.
And just a quick thought on that, because I've been listening to a lot of coverage on this, and I've been interviewing a lot of people regarding this. And Jonathan, a lot of people say if they do want change of government in Iran, it's actually going to be about the US putting boots on the ground to make that happen. All this firepower is not going to cause that change that they're looking for. Would you agree with that analysis?
Certainly having boots on the ground, you enjoy, if that's the right word for it, that intimacy of what's happening on the ground, of being able to move forces over to different locations to force through certain policies that you want to see. If you're doing it from an arm's length of dropping bombs, yeah, it's very difficult. But then again, we've had situations in which the United States has had boots on the ground, and it hasn't affected the level of change that needed to happen to democratize the societies there. Iraq is a prime example. Afghanistan is a prime example. So there's no guarantee that boots on the ground would actually make the difference. At the end of the day, Leanne, it comes down to, obviously, the Iranian people, trying to get in a position in which the IRGC is so weakened that they can then establish a government that is representative of them. There's been a lot of talk of the Kurds and the Kurds being armed and being able to fight their way through. Certainly that had great impact within Iraq and continues to have great impact with the Kurdish regional government and their ability to sway things that happen in Baghdad. The same type of scenario could be worked out in Iran eventually. I mean, let's face it, there are 10 million Kurds in a country of 90 million in Iran, and they are great fighters. They do have weapons, but nothing on the scale of what the Iraqi Kurds have. But the Iraqi Kurds would come in and help their brethren. That still is an option here. And then what the opposition's able to do, which has been completely pulverized and brutalized over the decades so that they are afraid to stick their head up because they get killed. Literally 32,000 people were slaughtered, Iranian people by the regime. So there's obviously this terror that still grips society there. But the moment that there is a sense that the regime is weakened enough for a wholesale overthrow, and that, of course, would include elements of violence to carry out such a thing, that's all stuff that could lay ahead. But ultimately, the IRGC has to be so weakened that such a possibility even becomes a possibility.
And President Zelensky has said Ukrainian drone experts are due in Qatar and also the UAE and Saudi Arabia this week. How much of a game changer will this be? Because we know Ukraine has been intercepting those drones that have been flown from Russia. They've got on-the-ground experience.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen those interceptors. They're remarkable. I mean, they buzz like crazy and they move rapidly and they do the job. It really can be a game changer. Right now, we've got this situation in which all these, attempts to neutralize these drones, the Shahed drones, one after another, it's a lot less expensive to manufacture those than the interceptors that take them out. And just the scale, the economic scale is just so imbalanced. But with these Ukrainian interceptors, it really is a game changer. Is it going to come in time? Is everybody going to be trained in time to be able to make a dent in this? If the conflict continues long enough, certainly it will. I would think that the surrounding countries of Iran that have been on the receiving ends of those Shahed drones and those missiles would want to have whatever defensive layer they have to be able to expediently, efficiently, and economically contain the problem. So the Ukrainians are well positioned to actually have an impact both in the near future, not immediate future, because it's going to take time to get this into place, and then long term.
Jonathan Watchell, as always, thank you so much for your analysis.
Pleasure, Leanne.
Let's continue this conversation with Hanan Hussein, a senior expert at Initiate Futures. Hanan, thank you so much for joining me today. A top Iranian security official warned Trump on social media to be careful so that you won't get eliminated, while Trump claims the war is very far ahead of schedule. How does this personal rhetoric affect the risk of escalation in the Iran conflict? Because we are seeing this war of words.
Thanks, Leanne. So I think, I'd view this as more of a narrative point scoring position. So, for example, when you look at right now, U.S. perceived leverage in terms of getting Iran on board with regard to, for example, a level of military destruction which the U.S. feels kind of facilitates its military objectives over there. That has kind of reached a pause. And on the Iranian front, it's more a words of survival. So, for example, we see that the attack that you alluded to in terms of narrative is something which was in retaliation to President Trump's remarks. So bringing these two things together, I think this pivot towards rhetoric kind of signals in my view, a little bit of an exhaustion of leverage on both sides. So, for example, if Iran wants to step up its defenses, the fact that it cannot exactly come up to terms with an end game when it comes to the United States is something which is a point of weakness, in my view. And from the United States front, we see that the costs of prolonging the war are starting to hit back home. So when you look at these two dimensions together, there's a bit of a standstill which is coming in, which is why we should be on the lookout for similar rhetoric to amplify in the near future.
And after Iran warned it would block oil exports if US and Israeli attacks continue, how serious is the risk that the Strait of Hormuz now becomes a major flashpoint in the conflict? As we talked about consumer prices in the US, we're seeing this closing of the strait choking global oil supply.
It's very serious. So I think this particular pivot can take these things global, and something which would not necessarily confine the current tension to the US-Iranian binary. It will obviously affect prices at a global scale. So a couple of things to consider. First of all, Strait of Hormuz, as we know, that it's very, very unlikely that many of the oil shipments, which are due to countries all around the world, are going to pass through in recent times because of Iran having a chokehold on that. But on that front as well, I think the Iranian weakness also comes into play because you want to keep a hold on it, but the Iranians are are a bit unclear about what a permanent chokehold would look like. So again, it is less about Iran's own intent. It's more about kind of choking prices and coming in. And I think that's where I think the larger costs start to dawn in on both sides. So for example, when you look at the GCC, and we do see shockwaves being heard as far as Southeast Asia, tells you that the United States and Iran would naturally have to then heed into demands coming from various other sectors, be it their partners, spanning continents, be it, for example, discussions happening in OPEC as well. And I think, when you look at the conflict dynamic, it kind of intensifies because this would kind of test the patience of governments that are willing to kind of coordinate business and public interest within their own territory. So a sovereign interest is kind of playing into the larger dynamic here, which threatens to widen as it goes. And I think this particular situation is also untenable. It's unsustainable. When you look at choking the Strait of Hormuz, that's one thing, but the implications coming from it are something which do not exactly benefit the U.S. and Iran, and obviously will test the temperatures and patience of key major economies spanning around the world, something which kind of puts U.S. partnerships as well as Iranian interests also on the line.
And Shehbaz Sharif has imposed emergency austerity and fuel-saving measures in Pakistan due to disruptions from the US-Israeli war on Iran. How vulnerable is Pakistan's economy to the ongoing Middle East conflict? And we are seeing these measures now come into place.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. So it's vulnerable on many levels. So first of all, Pakistan has limited forex reserves. There's been high inflationary pressure on the country as well. And Pakistan's history of, for example, procuring critical oil shipments from as far as Qatar are something that seem to be tempered and largely constrained. Pakistan is one of those countries which does not have a lot of strategic reserves on its back end. So the idea of kind of providing a buffer against these crisis situations is very limited. So I think Pakistan's austerity measures kind of signal a huge alarm within the country where I'm speaking from, when you have a population growth that's growing alarmingly, and as well as limited revenue scope. So Pakistan would naturally depend on kind of advancing diplomacy or seeking a peaceful end to this, because the cost coming in to bite Pakistan has little room to maneuver as well. So for example, the IMF structural constraints when it comes to their lending program is something that has been a long-standing constraint. So overall, the way the conflict pans out is having a more direct impact on Pakistan, and its ability and its lack of ability to shield itself from those external pressures is something which leaves it even more vulnerable in the times to come.
And I want to talk about where Israel fits in to all of this, if we can, because Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, says he'll probably travel to Israel next week. He's just been speaking in an interview with CNBC. And we also know that when it comes to an off-ramp to this war, Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel's goal is to end the Islamic Republic of Iran entirely, while Trump's administration frames the war differently. How does this difference in objectives affect the US and Israel's coordination and the potential duration of how long we could see this conflict go on for?
So let's take it one by one. When we talk about impact, I think it interferes with, for example, the level of coordination which both countries are willing to accept as something that is strategic. So for example, Israel's tendency to kind of see an end to this very clearly is part of a larger rhetoric which we've seen evolve in terms of spillovers into Lebanon as well, in Iran as well. So largely influenced by domestic constraints about taking Iran forward. And I think that's something which could run into a collision course with the US, because at present, the United States has been signaling in terms of how much does it want to stretch up its military arm. We've seen that there's been a lot of strong talk about strengthening those airstrikes, but at the same time, the US economy is not in the kind of stable shape that it was a couple months ago. Statistics show that unemployment has been on the rise. There's a lot of public pressure. You have midterms on the line as well, and as well as the United States' own ability to come up and say that, this is the end goal that we promised in Iran and we've achieved it. So the tendency of Iran to kind of survive these shockwaves is something which kind of adds to a greater split. So to answer your question, the lack of certainty on a core objective is something which could wane long-standing goodwill between U.S. and on Israel, on Iran, and the lack of continuity or lack of focus on how you want to see this goal to see this military intervention end is something which points to a little bit of a shortcoming. So I think the scramble from Washington to Tel Aviv to kind of coordinate expectations could be a sign of kind of tempering expectations and landing on a consensus. Will that consensus favor the U.S. as opposed to Israel? I think that's the point where the Trump administration will have to bite the bullet.
Hanan Hussein, thank you so much for joining me. Great to have you on the show. Now, Asian markets staged a sharp rebound on Tuesday after oil prices tumbled, easing fears of a prolonged shock to the global economy. It came after President Trump suggested the conflict with Iran could soon be winding down, calming energy markets that had been rattled by days of volatility. Patrick Falk has this report.
There was relief for markets in Asia on Tuesday after US President Donald Trump said conflict in Iran is, quote, complete, pretty much. South Korea's Kospi led the gains, closing up 5.3% following days of volatile trade, while Japan's Nikkei 225 ended the day 2.8% higher. Australia's ASX 200 rose by 1.1%. Travel stocks surged as oil prices pulled back after charging past the $100 level a day earlier. A spike in the cost of crude since the conflict began has unsettled global markets. But analysts warn developments in the Middle East could keep energy markets on edge in the long term.
Because even if the current war in this phase draws to an end, we now have a new chapter of geopolitical instability in that really important region of the world for oil and gas supplies.
Elsewhere, Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index rose by nearly 2.2%, while the Shanghai Composite tacked on about 0.6%. That after official figures showed Chinese exports jumped by more than 20% in the first 2 months of this year. It was almost 3 times the rate predicted by economists and puts the country on track to top its record annual trade surplus hit in 2025.
In 2026, China's foreign trade has posted a strong start, primarily driven by multiple factors, including recovering global demand, the release of policy dividends, pronounced industrial advantages, and heightened vitality among micro-market entities.
The release of the data comes as US President Donald Trump is set to visit Beijing early next month to meet Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Investors are eyeing calmer geopolitics to keep markets on steadier ground. Patrick Falk, Arabiya English.
Now, President Trump has spoken to Russia's Vladimir Putin regarding the ongoing situation in Iran. The two leaders talked after the biggest spike in oil prices since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Trump said Putin wanted to be helpful to Iran as sanctions on Russian oil are temporarily eased. Take a listen.
I had a very good call with President Putin. We had a lot of people on the line from our side, from his side. We were talking about Ukraine, which is just a never-ending fight. And there's tremendous hatred between President Putin and President Zelensky. They can't seem to get it together. But I think it was a positive call on that subject. And we obviously talked then about the Middle East. And he wants to be helpful. I said, you could be more helpful by getting the Ukraine-Russia war over with. That would be more helpful. But we had a very good talk, and he wants to be very constructive.
Let's discuss this further with former CIA official Ray McGovern. Ray, great to have you on the show. So we just heard there from President Donald Trump speaking with Vladimir Putin about the war in Iran amid these soaring oil prices and the easing of sanctions on Russian oil. Can Russia be considered a reliable partner for stabilizing global oil supplies right now?
Well, Russia can be a mediator, and that is what this call was all about. It's important to know who called whom. It was Trump that called Putin. Now, we talk a lot about market volatility, right? Well, what concerns Putin and Xi Jinping is presidential U.S. volatility, okay? Now, is there any good news in any of this? Yes, there is. Putin and Xi both realize that they have to treat this volatile president with kid gloves. And so when Trump calls Putin and says, in effect, can you help me out of this dilemma? I bit off more than I can chew. That call was not about Ukraine. Ukraine had nothing to do with it. He wanted to see if Putin could help him out by mediating an end to this thing. Now, the talks, I'm an old criminologist, okay? So I look at what the communique said, and the communique was quite interesting. The most operative passage was, I'm going to tell you right away that the conversation was businesslike. Now, the next word can be translated frank, and that has a negative connotation. But the next word was откровенный, which really means outspoken, straightforward, kind of frank in the way of being candid, okay? And constructively constructive. That's the way Ushakov, the fellow who works for Putin, described it. Now, I'm sure it was, and I'm virtually sure, because Putin himself called all those Arab leaders about a week ago and talked with them. And then Lavrov, the foreign minister, said, look, you Arab leaders, they're sitting there right next to me. He says, look, I'll use an old Bedouin expression. You can't ride two camels at the same time. Okay, so you made your bed, now lie on it, he says. So there's a good cop and there's a bad cop. And in any case, the bottom line is the Kremlin has very, 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 very great interest in serving as a mediator. The fly in the ointment now is Israel doesn't want to stop this thing, even though it's being pretty much pulverized. And Iran, Iran in the old days would probably accept this mediation without any question. But, they've been sold down the road by lots of people, especially the U.S., and they're not above thinking that Russia could sell us down the road as well.
So,
we're winning.
Ray, I just want to ask you a question, because apparently Vladimir Putin has held a phone call with Pezeshkian today. We do know that's the Iranian president. But, we're talking about Vladimir Putin right now and possibly mediating in the Iran war. But Vladimir Putin's come out and he congratulated the selection of the new supreme leader in Iran, Mujtaba Khamenei. He said congratulations to him. I find it quite interesting when it comes to Russia, and maybe you can give me more insight into this, but Russia have lost a lot of allies lately, Venezuela, Syria, and they didn't come to the rescue to help those countries. Why isn't Russia helping its allies at the moment?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is that Iran is almost as strategically important to the Russians as Ukraine. I say almost. I think it's equivalent. I mean, it's Russia's under his southern belly, so to speak. All kinds of grief has come through that soft underbelly, okay? And so the Russians are not going to be sitting aside watching Iran be carved up, or much less obliterated, to use a favorite word of the president. So this is very important for the Russians. Now, as I say, kind of it's ironic, but it's a good thing that Putin is perspicacious. He's cautious. He doesn't want to irritate this very mercurial, this very unpredictable president. And the Chinese are doing the same thing. As a matter of fact, I would have thought that Xi Jinping would have canceled a visit of Trump to go to Beijing just a couple of weeks from now. They haven't. They have very, very matter of fact. We deal with everyone. So as long as they humor Trump, and as long as Trump knows that he needs them real bad right now, there's a good chance that Putin, acting on behalf of the Iranians mostly, and Xi Jinping as well, and Trump trying to extricate himself from this impossible situation, will be able to lean on the Israelis for Trump's part and come to some sort of resolution of this thing before the whole world falls apart.
So, Ray,
with the of the strait.
What I find fascinating is if Donald Trump was sitting right here and having a conversation with you, I'm sure he would say to you, the US have the strongest military. We obliterating Iran. We are, destroying energy facilities. We've got rid of Ali Khamenei. They got rid of the Navy. They're going to attack the missiles. We've heard all of the rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump, which a lot of people would say is possibly a lot of talk, but also a lot of destruction has happened by the US in Iran at the moment. But I want to talk to you a little bit about intelligence sharing, because I know you are former CIA, so you probably know a lot more about this than I do. So reports do suggest that Russia is supplying Iran with intelligence to target US forces. What do you make of this?
I think those reports are correct. And when I compared notes with a fellow Russian specialist, I said, what do you think? And he said, one word, karma. Karma. In other words, that's precisely what the US is doing for the Ukrainian forces in Ukraine. So why not Russia do the same thing slowly, carefully, and kind of below the surface? I'm sure they're giving target information to the Iranians, and the Chinese are doing the same thing with their very, very sophisticated intelligence collection ship right off the shores of Iran. What I would say, you said if I was in conversation with Trump, I would say, look, Mr. Trump, are you bragging about the worst mistake you could possibly make, and that is make a martyr out of the supreme leader, the second person in Islam? Are you bragging about killing 170 little girls between the age of 9 and 12? Is that what we're about now? So, Mr. President, you ought to really try to get somebody sensible to mediate this thing. And I'm really quite impressed at how gingerly the Russians have approached this. They're prepared to mediate, and and Trump needs them real bad.
Fascinating. Speaking to you, Ray McGovern. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're most welcome.
President Trump has been accused of not taking the conflict seriously enough after he joked about sinking Iranian ships. Speaking from his Mar-a-Lago estate, the US president told fellow Republicans it was more fun to sink ships than capture them. Take a listen.
In fact, I got a little upset with our people. I said, what quality of ship? Excellent, sir. Top of the line. I said, why did we just capture the ship? We could have used it. Why did we sink them? They said, it's more fun to sink them. I said, they like sinking them better. They say it's safer to sink them. I guess it's probably true.
Let's go live to Washington now to speak to our correspondent, Sarah Firth. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. That was, of course, Donald Trump's speech last night. Lots of people were watching that. But Trump did describe the sinking of 46 Iranian vessels as fun and a short-term excursion. Given the verified casualties on both sides, how is the administration responding to critics who are arguing this rhetoric is actually at odds with the gravity of the military activity right now?
Well, Leanne, look, we've seen the administration double down in the past on President Trump's very aggressive rhetoric when it comes to this conflict in particular and past conflicts. It's interesting. We watched that clip of him speaking there in Florida. He was talking about a discussion he was having with a member of the military where he said, he was asking, why don't they capture those Navy ships? And the response he said was that it's more fun to sink them. Now, that was met in the room with laughter from some of those Republican attendees at that conference. But it certainly raised some concern in military circles here in Washington. You've had, again, recently with this conflict and the rhetoric around it from the administration, from President Trump himself, from the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, you've had very serious criticism that this is making light of what is a very serious situation with U.S. service members being killed. Now, you've just had the dignified transfer of the 7th US service member to have been killed in this conflict with Iran. And so you've had the likes, Leanne, of Senator Tim Kaine. He referred to a previous comment of President Trump's when he'd spoken about the war being a short excursion. He described this as deeply disrespectful to service members. Now, that's the mood that I'm getting from a lot of the sources I'm speaking to within the military community. Again, this isn't the first time that President Trump has used this kind of rhetoric that seems very removed from the reality on the ground in this conflict, very removed from what service members are facing, the risks that they're facing as they participate in this conflict launched by the United States and Israel against Iran. And so there's certainly a sense that it's rhetoric not particularly fitting of the seriousness of the moment.
And Sarah, I did watch Pete Hegseth speak a little bit earlier, and he seemed a lot more measured and actually didn't seem as bombastic as he had been before. But President Trump has said the conflict is pretty much complete. However, with Iran's new leadership vowing to continue resistance, how do the president's claims of an imminent end to the war actually make any sense to the facts on the ground?
Yes, this is the question we've been asking the administration repeatedly since the start of this war. We're now well into the second week. And the question really is, what is the long-term plan here? And the administration hasn't, Leanne, given a clear answer. Now, you're right. You heard President Trump coming out and saying that the war, he felt, was almost complete. But then you had the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. He came out and said, look, this is just the beginning. So President Trump then, in that speech we heard on Monday, backing up the Secretary of Defense, saying that, yes, this is just the beginning. President Trump saying we could go further and we're going to go further. This is just an example of the very mixed messaging around this conflict in Iran. There are questions on Capitol Hill about the legality of this conflict. Most Democrats, Leanne, as critical of the conflict. You've had Iraqi, Afghanistan veterans, American service members who've been on the front lines of America's conflicts in the past in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've spoken to Congress. They've told of some of the realities of war that they've faced, and they've warned as well the Trump administration about the potential for longer-term involvement the more this continues. You have had Americans now paying attention, of course, as you guys have been reporting. Here in the US, Americans potentially facing higher prices at the petrol pump. That will really put the pressure on President Trump. He's made an explicit promise to Americans that he would lower those prices. And you've also, Leanne, got a lot of focus here on the fact that whilst the administration is championing and expressing its victory, if you like, over the Iranian Navy and the success they've had in their military campaign against the Navy, what Iran has shown is that they don't need that Navy to successfully disrupt transport through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's clear, despite the rhetoric coming from the White House, that this is a vastly different reality on the ground. And Leanne, one further point that I want to raise, because a lot of people are talking about it here, particularly humanitarian groups, military veteran families, about the reality of war and the impact of it. And I want to read you something from UNICEF, from one of their spokesmen, James Elder. He was speaking about the fact that we've had the reports, of course, about the attack on the school in Iran at the start of the war. There's new video that's just been released that seems to back up claims that it was a US strike. Now, he said, here we are, another war. He said the tolerance for the killing of children seems to be expanding. The killing, he says, of a single child should stop us cold. So there is really a sense that the rhetoric around this conflict right from the start, it is undermining the reality that US service members are facing, but also, Leanne, the deaths of Iranians and people in the conflict on the ground.
Sarah Firth, as they say, a lot of the wars are won on propaganda, but very interesting. Thank you so much for joining me. A reminder of our top stories. The price of oil drops after Trump makes assurances, but his Secretary of War promises the most intense day of US strikes on Iran. Meanwhile, Russia's Vladimir Putin holds a phone call with the US president to discuss the ongoing conflict and a solution to the global energy crisis. But critics say Trump is not taking the war seriously as he jokes about sinking Iranian ships. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, follow us on X, and we'll be back in a couple of hours with a W News Extra. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.